I'll be completely honest here. The original Sig P229 isn't exactly graceful. In terms of ergonomics, it falls somewhere between, I guess, a Beretta 92 and maybe a Coke can. Its slide is just kind of blocky, its bore axis is high, its trigger reach is long. But I tell you this, you will not give a fuck about any of that once you start shooting this thing. And that's what we're going to talk about today here on Hipster Tactical. Alright, the original Sig P229 in 9mm. And I think you're in terms of first impressions for this gun, you might be inclined to think it's just kind of overbuilt for 9mm, and it's got a thicker slide than most other Sigs, than all other Sigs. And it just feels heavy, it feels kind of bulky, and the gun was originally designed for 40 cal, and it was designed to be stronger and heftier to handle those higher pressures that 40 cal generated. So, you know, does this gun make sense in 9mm? Do you need a gun this bulky and heavy in 9mm? And long story short, I think this gun is awesome in 9mm, and I actually had a P229, you know, a few years ago in 357 Sig, and it was fine, it was nice, but man, in 9mm, this thing is just such a nice shooter, and that's really, you know, if you don't want to watch the rest of the review, that's the key takeaway here, that this thing in 9mm is just a wonderful shooting gun, and it's just very enjoyable to shoot. And in my written review, I say it has like kind of an addictive quality to the way it shoots in 9mm. So that's kind of my key takeaway. But I want to get into some of the background of this gun as to why it exists and kind of the thought behind its design, and then of course we'll get into some more nuanced discussion of how it shoots and how it handles and just what it's like to own and experience. So the story of the P229, like so many other interesting 90s era handguns, kind of begins with the 10mm automatic. And if we go back to 1986, there was this infamous shootout in Miami where some heavily armed criminals outgunned the FBI agents that were trying to take them in. A couple FBI agents were killed, so the FBI decided they needed their agents to be more heavily armed, to have more capable handguns. So the 10mm auto had been developed in the early 80s. Jeff Cooper was one of the consultants on that project, worked with a company called Dornhouse and Dixon to design a cartridge for their gun, the Bren 10. And then this company in Sweden called Norma Precision, I think is the current name for that company, they developed the round. So fast forward to 1990, the FBI adopts the 10mm round in the Smith & Wesson Model 1076 was the gun that Smith & Wesson designed to chamber that 10mm round, and I actually have a Smith & Wesson 4506, which you may have seen my review of. Love this gun, but the Smith & Wesson 1076 is basically this gun with a slightly shorter barrel and slide, but same frame, and, you know, obviously chambered to 10mm as opposed to 45. But so the FBI started issuing that thing beginning in 1990, and pretty quickly they realized that 10mm was just too powerful for just kind of an everyday duty gun caliber, and a lot of the agents couldn't handle it. Of course, the gun was humongous too. So they decided to start taking the 10 millimeter and loading it to about 2/3 of its ballistic potential. So it was less powerful, a little easier to handle. And once they started doing that, Smith & Wesson pretty quickly got the idea. It's like, okay, if we're not loading this cartridge to its full potential, couldn't we just shorten the case? So that epiphany led to the 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge. And here's a 10 millimeter, here's a 40. And you can see that they are basically the same diameter. They're kind of the same cartridge in a way, but the 40 is just shorter. The compelling thing about the 40 cal is that because it was shorter, it could be chambered in 9 millimeter sized guns. And that really captured the interest of law enforcement in the United States. And going into the 90s, it started to become kind of the de facto caliber. A lot of police departments started switching to 40. Glock was actually beat Smith & Wesson to the market, as I'm sure many of you know, with the first 40 caliber handgun, the Glock 23, which is basically just a Glock 19 with different barrel and, you know, I'm sure there were some other changes too, but basically a Glock 19 chambered in 40. Then, you know, Smith & Wesson followed a few years later with the 40-06. Anyway, so what was Sig Sauer doing during all this time? Well, up until that point, you know, they've been making guns since the 70s, starting with the P220, but the guns they've been making have a unique design characteristic in that they used slides that were made from sheet metal stampings. So, and then the ends were welded on. They had a solid breech block put inside, and that design was not strong enough to handle the pressures that 40 generated. So, you know, here's my P225, also known as the P6, but this slide is a stamping, is a metal stamping, and you can see that this part right here is, you know, where they put a breech block into the slide to kind of house the firing pin and the breech face and those things. And if you look inside, you can see where the fronts are just kind of welded on. So, I mean, that worked great for 9 millimeter and even 45, but 40 cal generates higher pressures than even 45. So Sig realized they needed something that was beefier, stronger, and could stand up to these pressures. So they decided to go with a fully machined slide. They took the P228 as a template, which was kind of their shortened P226, basically the same footprint as this gun, P225, but double stack. They went to this slide that was machined from a solid chunk of steel, which was obviously a lot heftier than the sheet metal slides that they've been using. So during this time, they were also developing their own cartridge, the 357 Sig round. And 357 Sig, like the 40 cal, it was also based on a shortened 10 millimeter casing, but with 357 Sig, it's bottlenecked down to like a 9 millimeter, roughly sized projectile. And 357 Sig generates, from what I've heard, it can generate even higher pressures than the 40 Smith & Wesson. So, you know, I don't know if they had that in mind when they were designing the P229 from the get-go. Probably. I mean, it makes sense. To that end, they made the slide, not only is it just a departure from the stampings that they've been using, but they thickened up the sidewalls. And if you look at one of these older P229s, you see this kind of ridge here, this flared area on the side of the slides, and you can see it kind of coming out on the sides there. And in forums, I've heard this referred to as the reinforcing band, and I think that makes sense. I don't know if that's an official Sig Sauer nomenclature, but yeah, I mean, that's more or less what it is. They thickened up the slide down there. I think it adds about 3 millimeters to the thickness of the slide versus a P228, and it also adds about 2 ounces to the weight of the slide over the P228 on which it's based. So I'll do a quick comparison for you to show that on camera, and I've got a lot more detail on this in my written review with measurements and stuff, so check that out if you want a little more context. But this is a P225 slide, this is the P229 slide, and if you hold them up, you know, you can kind of see how how much farther out that edge comes on the P229 slide. It's like I said, about 3 millimeters wider than the P225 slide. And it's worth noting that all the SIGs pretty much have the same slide width. Like I've compared this P225 to my P239s, P220s, P245s, P228. They all have pretty much the same slide width. In 1992, they released the P229 in 40 cal first, and I guess it was pretty popular right out of the gate. Fast forward 2 years, they released the same gun, P229, in 357 SIG, and then later that year, they finally introduced the P229 in 9mm. So one other thing I will mention about the slide dimensions on the older legacy slide P229s is, I don't know how or if this applies to the newer ones, because I've never owned one, but there are differences between the slides of 9mm and the 357, like the 9mm P229s and then the 40 and 357 P229s. The 40 and the 357 use the same slide, whereas the 9mm uses a slightly different slide. From what I can tell, if you look closely at the slides of the older P229s, the slide comes up a bit higher on the 40 and 357 SIG models, and it's a little more flush with the barrel hood here on this 9mm. Also, I tend to think this step that you see here, where it comes in above this reinforcing band, as we're calling it, I think it steps in a bit farther on the 9mm. So that means that the top half of the slide on the 40 and 357 SIG P229s is a bit thicker than what you find on the 9mm. Now, I think the overall width, which is at these reinforcing bands here, I'll turn it like that, that's the ultimate extremity of width. I think that's the same on the 9mm and the 40 357 P229s. But again, the 40 357s are a bit higher and they are a bit thicker above this reinforcing band. So I saw this in the local gun shop, and you don't see a lot of these older SIGs, older P229s, I'm sorry, in 9mm, especially ones that are from before they started putting rails on all of them. So I hemmed and hawed and kind of molded over. I was like, okay, I'll buy it. It was a pretty good price. I got them to knock a few dollars off. So here I am with this bulky, hefty hulk of a handgun in 9mm. But as soon as I brought it to the range, I mean, this thing is just great to shoot in 9mm, and it definitely does have, in my opinion, a different character to it compared to the P228, on which it's basically based. Some of the words I use to describe the experience of shooting this is just seamless, and the recoil is just kind of transparent, and it's very soft shooting. Like I said in my written review, it's just kind of addictive. You just want to shoot it. It feels almost like a launch pad in your hands. I mean, the slide is just wide and heavy, and it feels unflappable as you're just pounding 9mm rounds through this thing, and it makes you just feel kind of unstoppable. You just want to keep shooting it. In my written review, I compared it to a tactical Pez dispenser, and like, that's kind of what it feels like. It just cycles through these rounds like it's nothing. My 5906, that's another big heavy 9mm, and it's even quite a bit heavier than this. That thing's 38 ounces, so it's it's 7 or 8 ounces heavier than this. This, honestly, it feels a little more stable and planted in the hand than that does. So, you know, I think that wide slide does kind of give you this X factor. That wide heavy slide kind of gives you this X factor in terms of its character when you're shooting it. All that said, as much as I love shooting this gun, it is a joy to shoot. It's not really my best shooting gun yet. I mean, I've had this thing a grand total of a month. I've put about, I don't know, between 300 and 400 rounds through it, and still getting to know it, of course. But to me, you know, I talked about how just seamless the recoil is, and how almost transparent it is as you're shooting it. And while that's great, I mean, it just gives you this kind of zen-like calm as you're shooting it and as it's cycling. I don't find it as communicative and quite as engaging as some other guns, and I've talked about this a lot in reference to the Beretta 92 in my other videos, but the Beretta 92 just it feels very communicative. Like you get a sense of where your shots are hitting and how they're hitting, and there's just kind of this feedback with that gun. I don't find that as much with this and most of the other SIGs, honestly, but my P229, for instance, I think it fits my hand a bit better. You know, the smaller proportions, the smaller trigger reach, I can just get more hand around this single stack grip, and I actually tend to shoot so far, you know, I've put many more rounds through P239s than my P229, but I shoot this a little more on point of aim, and it's a little more accurate for me. But it's not really a knock on the P229. It's just, I think the smaller size of the grip works a little better for me with the P239. One other thing I wanted to mention is that these are the factory grips for the P229. I just figured with the OG P229 I'd review it with the OG grip setup, but there are certainly other grip options that are available, and many of which I think would definitely be better for me having smaller hands. One of those is the G10 grips that Hogue makes. They are, you know, shallower from front to back. They have less of a hump here, and they're a little thinner overall. Those are known to be better for small hands. I have these also made by Hogue, these rubber grips. They actually came on the gun. You know, these are even bulkier than the factory grips, but I honestly kind of like these better because in the absence of a aggressive texture like you get with the G10 grip, I kind of like, you know, the rubber has a bit more tack to it, sticks in your hand a little better. Anyway, you know, since I've been bitching about the grips, it's clearly there are other options available. I just kind of wanted to show it in the OG format. And just so we're clear, adding grips to a gun in no way changes its function or how it performs. It's purely an ergonomic thing that's for added comfort for shooting. It in no way modifies how the gun works. So, you know, we've talked about the differences in the older P229s versus the newer P229s, and as I said, this is an older one. I looked at the serial number. It's hard to find exact dates, but I think this was probably made around 95, something like that. So starting in 2009, SIG changed the P229, and this might get a little confusing, but I'm going to do my best to kind of summarize the changes that happened. So they changed the slide, first and foremost. The post-2009 P229s, you'll see, have full height slide serrations, unlike the half height slide serrations, which you find on the older ones. And the older ones came to be called Legacy P229s or Legacy Slide P229s. In addition to that, they went to a longer external extractor on the post-2009 P229s. That's pretty easy to spot. On the 9mm post-2009 P229s, they went back to a slide that was pretty much the same width as all other SIGs had been. Basically 1 inch, give or take, you know, almost exactly 1 inch. Now, they also, on the post-2009 9mm P229s, they had always used what was essentially a P228 frame. I think it was exactly a P228 frame. The grips, the mags, the locking insert, the internal part. The 9mm P229 always shared those things with the P228. Starting in 2009, SIG changed that. So the The 40 and 357 P229s had always had a slightly beefier frame and a slightly roomier mag well. So they made the 9mm after 2009. They started making them with basically the same frame as the 40s and 357. In doing that, they, because the magwell was a little wider, the post-2009 9mm P229 magazines are a little wider. So there could be some compatibility issues there, depending on what you have. And sometimes the post-2009 9mm P229s are referred to as the P229-1s. Now, I don't think P229-1 applies to the post-2009 40 and 357 P229. So, and this -1 business that's not like a consumer-facing, thing. It's just something that astute purveyors of Pew, like you and I, pick up on. That's not like I said, like a consumer-facing SIG marketing thing. Also, I had mentioned that when they made the switch in 2009, the 9mm P229s again have that, kind of classic SIG slide width. Now, I don't think that applies to the newer 40 and 357 P229s. And I don't have one of those, so I can't say for sure. But from what I've read, the newer 40 and 357 P229s have a slightly wider, heftier slide than the newer 9mm ones. So my guess is they the 40s and 357s retained that greater width that the earlier legacy P229s had always had. And my guess is what you'd find is that it's basically the same width as my legacy 9mm P229. So I know this is very confusing, and I've got a little more detail and context about all of the differences between the generations and the slides and everything, and the frames on my written review. So check that out if you want a little more clarity on the differences. So which one's better? Which one do you want? And I mean, nothing gets gun hipsters more riled up than talking about the differences between new SIG and old SIG. There are some just purists who swear by the older SIGs and say that the newer SIGs just aren't what they were. I guess it is true to say that they aren't what they were. It's kind of a different company, and a lot of the parts that they put in the SIGs today are outsourced, and whereas back in the 80s and 90s, the things were made basically under one or two roofs. Sometimes the slides were made in New Hampshire, sometimes the frames came from Germany, like this one. Sometimes they were all made in Germany. Like before that, they were all made in Germany. So I tend to think that you're gonna get a perfectly good gun if you buy a new SIG. I mean, there's been some recalls and stuff that have been present in the news, but I think by and large you're going to get a good gun if you buy like a new P229. That said, there is something just special about one of these older SIGs, and I do kind of like the older ones. I mean, this is hipster tactical. One would expect that. This thing it's solid, it's well made, it has this nice heavy presence in the hand. I mean, it just feels like Sig Sauer at its best. That's what I like about owning guns like this. So, and plus, a new P229 costs, at least $1,000. Looking online, even the basic ones are like $1,000. If you get a Legion, it's like $1,200, and there are plenty of used SIGs out there that are going to be good and just solid, reliable, accurate, nice shooting pistols like this one. And I paid $550 for this, out the door. It's a great gun, and it's gonna last a long time. There's a little wear and patina on it, but it's a really solid gun. If you are looking for one of these, it's interesting. Most of the older ones, like this one with the legacy slide, most of those you see like on Gunbroker and online, most of those are going to be in 40 cal, and that's because when this was a big kind of mainstay for law enforcement, most of most police departments ordered it in 40 cal. So that's what you find like kind of on the surplus market. Honestly, you find 357 Sig P229s, older ones. You see those more often than I think you see the 9mm ones. The older 9mm tend to be a little pricier when you see them online versus the 40s. I guess the 357 Sig ones command a little bit of a premium too. And especially the older ones with no rails. They started adding rails, I think, at some point in the late 90s. So to see this, like I said, older legacy slide 9mm P229 with no rail, it was a little bit uncommon, so that's why I definitely wanted to pick it up. So as far as a concealed carry gun, this thing is officially a compact, and it is. It's shorter in the slide than a P226, and it's shorter in grip height than a P226. But talking the legacy model here specifically, its slide is thicker than the P226, and it's still heavy, it's still bulky, and interestingly, looking at the slide width, the slide is basically exactly the same width as a Beretta 92. I can't remember the exact measurement in terms of millimeters off the top of my head. It's in my written review, but yeah, this thing is a hoss. For me, it's certainly you can carry it. It's compact enough, and the grip isn't too long that you'll never be able to hide it. But as I've said in other reviews, just I feel like thinner guns make more sense for concealed carry. As I've mentioned, my P239, it's just it's thinner than this. The grip is easier to hide, and for me, it's just a better option for carry. And honestly, as I've said, at this point, I shoot it a little better than the P229. I think I enjoy shooting the P229 a little more just because it's such a soft and smooth shooter, and it's really nice. And another gun that I guess is worth mentioning, I also reviewed my P88 compact a few months ago, and you know, this is kind of in the same size genre as the P229, P228, just kind of a mid-sized double stack DASA gun. And really in every dimension, I feel like this is a better carry gun, just from a size and comfort standpoint. And it slides, you know, quite a bit thinner. I don't know how well you can see it here on camera, but it's just less bulky. It carries just as much ammo. Not that that's a huge concern. And I think at the end of the day, the P88 is probably more accurate. It's probably one of the most, if not the most accurate, just DASA service pistols out there. But you know, these are rare and fairly expensive. I think a P229 is a more realistic option to find on the market. In any case, I think the P229 would excel as just kind of a mid-sized do-it-all gun, carry sometimes gun. Yeah, you can definitely carry it, especially in the winter. It may not be the most comfortable as something with a thinner slide like this, but it can fill that role, and it's obviously wonderful to shoot. It's 100% reliable. You know, these guns are known for their dependability. So in conclusion, my big takeaway with the P229 it's just a joy to shoot. You know, at this point, I'm not sure, in my current lineup, I'm not sure what kind of practical role it fills yet. I have other guns I think that do carry better, and maybe I'm just looking for all-out accuracy that I shoot a little better, but this gun is awesome. And if you don't have one in your lineup, or you know, you don't have other guns that, you know, maybe fill a dedicated carry role or a dedicated shooter role, I think this can do it all. And I have to think that's kind of what Sig was thinking when they devised this. It was just a good mid-sized do-it-all gun, and something that I think, you know, they could sell to police departments, and I think it was very successful in that regard. And a lot of law enforcement agencies picked it up, and the Secret Service used this. P229s for a while. They used them in 357 Sig. I think they also used P239s. But you know, this gun has a respected history in law enforcement, and it has a really good track record, and it's something you can trust and certainly depend on for whatever you're doing with a handgun. So yeah, I think if you want to get one of these old P229s, it's a great investment. You'll probably pay a little less than you will for a newer P229, and you're kind of going to get that old school Sig heritage that I think if you're watching my videos, you probably gravitate to that as well. So yeah, I love the old school P229, and I think if you can find one for a reasonable price, I think you should get one. So thank you so much for watching. Check out my written review. The link is in the description. Like I said, I've got more detail on kind of the slide measurements and the differences between the various generations of P229s. Also, for the next video, I want to give you a little preview. I'm going to be featuring the FN HPDA, also known as the BDA9. And in some ways, this is basically a double action, single action Browning high power, but in some ways it's not. So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. This is a pretty rare gun. I was pretty excited to get my hands on this. So writing that review now, and hopefully next month be able to get that one up. So again, thank you so much for watching. If you like beats, hip-hop instrumentals like the one I used in the intro, check out the link to my SoundCloud, also in the description. And until next time, this is Hipster Tactical, and I am Matt.